Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and create our text inputs, and you can see that these text inputs are basically exactly the same, both the first and the second one, and then clearly between iOS and Android. A few things to note about this. On this right side of this border right here, this is all text input, so somewhere someone can tap and type into. And then on the left, this is actually a button that someone should be able to tap. Final thing is this text input, the second one, you shouldn't be able to actually type into it. So it's got this disabled state, and it's just a slightly lighter gray background. And those are kind of the main elements of this text input. So thinking about that, we know that we're going to have to wrap our entire component in a view, just so we're returning a single component. And we know that we're going to have a button here that should be tapped and handle an on press. Then over here, we're going to have a text input that a user can actually type into, and that we should be able to detect those changes and pass those up to whatever component's calling them. So give this a shot of actually building, otherwise let's go ahead and start building this. First thing I'm going to do is actually create a new component, and we'll do that in this components directory. And in a larger application, you may have multiple different types of text input. So I'm just going to say, I'm going to create a new component called text input, and then we'll create the kind of the boilerplate file. So we've got our index.js, we've got our styles.js, and then we'll also create the actual component.js. And in this case, I'm not going to call it text input because we could have different types of text inputs. I'll call this one input with button because it's a text input with a button. Save that, and then next we can set up our export. So we'll import the input with button from /input with button, and we'll also import the styles from .styles, and we can go ahead and export them like we've done before. Save that. Now let's actually set up the boilerplate for our style sheet. So we'll say and we'll actually write those styles later. So again, looking back to these images, we said we'll need a view, a text input, we'll use touchable opacity for the actual button, and then since there's text inside of that touchable opacity, we'll need the text component as well. So looking at the input with button.js, first thing we'll do is import React, and then we'll also import prop types from React. And then as I said before, we'll do import rn. We want the view, we're going to use the text component, we'll actually use the touchable highlight, I think I said touchable opacity beforehand, and then finally we want the text input as well. We know we'll need the styles later, so we'll import styles from styles, and now we can actually go ahead and start building our component. So we're going to say input with button isn't from, it'll be a function, a stateless function, export default input with button. So all of our boilerplate should be set up, and when I save that, I've actually got prettier set up. So it changed the code up a bit, but we'll go ahead and change that. Next up, let's actually add these inputs to the home screen, and then we can start just setting up passing props to it so we know what we're actually going to be working with. So going to my home.js file, I'm going to import input with button from components, text input, and then we'll go ahead and render these. Those will be the next components here. So a few things we know we want to add. We need to be able to specify whatever this button text is going to be. We need to be able to specify whether it's editable or not. And we also need to access the on press. So when this button is pressed, we need that. So with those things in mind, let's go ahead and first we'll have a button text. We'll have an on press, and that's when that button's going to be pressed. And we'll also have editable. That one's not needed in this case, so I can go ahead, skip that, and we'll pass button text here, and then we're going to say for the second input it's going to be false for editable. A few other things we want to do is let's actually set up some handlers for this input with button. So I'm going to import component up here. We're going to go ahead and convert this to a kind of a typical React component. So I'm going to say class home extends component, And inside of there, we'll have a render method where we will actually return this component. And you can see we're getting an error up here, and that's because we need to set values for this button text, this onPress. Okay, I actually deleted those because it was still throwing errors for us. And then we need to make sure we add that export default home in, which I did not have, and that was thus throwing that error. So let's also set up a few variables. First, we're going to say const temp, temp base currency, and that's just going to be USD. Then we're going to say const temp quote currency, and that's going to be pound. I'm also going to set up two other things just because we'll need them in a moment, and that's going to be const base price, and we'll just say 100, and then we'll say temp quote price, and I'll just say 79.74 because it was that at some point in time. Okay, so these are all set up. These are going to be, we can say our button text here is going to be temp base currency. Make sure to close this. And then here we'll have temp base currency. This one's going to be the quote currency. And then I'm going to create some new functions up here. First off is going to be handle press base currency, and we'll just say console.log press base, since we're not actually hooking those up yet. And we're also going to have handle press quote currency, and we'll say press quote. And then down here, let's actually wire these in, and those are going to be the functions that are called when these are pressed. So I'm going to say pass the onPress prop, and this is going to be this.handle base handle press base currency. Down here, I'll have onPress, and that's going to be this.handle press quote currency. Save this, pretty things up for us. So we're passing a bunch of props, but we're not actually seeing anything. So let's actually do some stuff now. So looking at my input with button, first thing, we know we're going to have an onPress. We're going to have our button text, and there's also going to be an editable prop. So I said we were going to do stuff, but let's actually set up the prop types for this. So I'll say input.proptypes. It's going to be an object. The onPress, that's going to be proptypes.func, which is like function. Button text, that's going to be proptypes.string. And then editable is going to be proptypes.boolean. We'll also set a value for this editable, a default value, and that's just going to default to true. And then we're getting a bunch of errors here. We just got a warning over here. And you can see that down here, it's saying proptype editable is invalid, and that's because it's not actually proptypes.boolean, it's proptypes.bool. All right, now let's actually start creating this component so we can actually start seeing some stuff. So I'm going to delete that null and go ahead and return some parentheses. Like I said before, we know everything's going to have to be wrapped in a view. And then on the left side, we're going to have a touchable highlight, and this is going to be this button over here. So we can close this component. And inside of this touchable highlight, we're going to have text. And inside of that is where we're actually going to pass the button text. And let's also pass the onPress to the touchable highlight, because that's when that touchable highlight is pressed is when the onPress should actually be called. Then looking over at our screen, we've got this border, so we're going to create another component, and that's going to be view, just a view, and we'll apply a style to this already, and we'll say styles.border. And finally, we can actually display that text input that we've been talking about and is actually at the core of everything. So you can see nothing's actually showing up. We've just got the text here. When I go ahead and tap it, you can see a black background show up, and we'll take care of all of this. Let's actually go ahead and set up some styles for all of this so we can just focus on building up the styles. So first few things. First off, we've got the style for the input, so we'll say styles.input. we're also going to have this button container. So I'll say style is equal to styles dot button container. And then down in the text, we'll say style is equal to styles dot button text. And then we'll set up our style for here. And this will be styles dot container. Okay, let's make some pretty text inputs now. So we know we've got, let's go to the container, the styles.js for our text input. And we know we've got the container property, we've got, button container, we've got the button text, and we've also got the actual input. And we also do not want to forget about our little border. So first off, looking at our container, we know the background color, and that's by default going to be white. And if you remember to our app/index.js, which I'll open now, we've got that white property set up. We also want the width, and we always want things to be consistent between all screens. So I'm actually going to use 90% rather than an exact pixel width, and that's something we can actually use with React Native Extended Style Sheet, is actually specify percentage widths rather than exact widths. Let's also set a height, and we're going to use this height in a few places, so I'm going to create a new variable up here. I'm going to say input height, and this height is going to be 48, and I'm also going to create a border radius because we'll need this in a few spots. And this border radius is going to be 4. So down here, we'll scroll to height, and we'll set this to be input height. We'll also set border radius and make this border radius. A few other things we want to add. First off is going to be the flex direction. By default in React Native, the flex direction is going to be column, so it's going to stack things on top of each other. We actually want this to be row because we want the button to be on the left, then we want the separator, and then we want the actual input. And if we look at the component, if I can find it, you can see that's how we've got it set up. We've got our button, we've got our border, and then we've got our text input. So that flex direction is going to tell it to display those in a row rather than in a column. And then we're going to want to align things vertically within this. So for example, the button text, we want to vertically align it, and since we're using row, we're going to use align items, and that'll be center. And the final thing is just we want to give everything just a tad bit of space vertically, so we're going to say margin vertical, and we'll just give it a margin of 11. And I made a typo because of course I did, and that's down here on this view. We want to say style is equal to styles, not styles. So save this, and you can see things are starting to come together. We've still got this ugly little button over here, but we've got what looks like an input. So now we can go back to our styles. Let's jump in here, and let's take care of the actual button container now. So we're going to want to make the actual height the same as the input, and then we want to make sure we align items inside of this vertically and horizontally. So I'm going to say align item center, and then I'm going to also say justify content center, just to ensure that no matter what, it is centered there. And regardless of if the background color is this white or gray, we want to make sure the background color for the button is going to be white, so we can go ahead and specify that here. And since we're setting a background color here, we want to make sure we actually specify the border radius here as well. So we want to say border top left radius is going to be border radius, and then we want to say border bottom left radius is also going to be border radius. So that shouldn't change anything when we look at this, other than actually seeing that when we tap it, it's now taking up the full height, and we've still got that border radius on the left and right, but we do not have a border radius on the right side, which is exactly what we want. We can now go ahead and work with our button text. A few things we want here. First off is to actually bump up the font weight, and we'll use, again, a string of 600. We'll then set the font size, and what we've currently got isn't quite the size we want, so we're going to say a font size of 20. And then we want to give it a bit of padding on either side, so we're going to give it a padding horizontal. So padding horizontal means on the left and the right of 16. And finally, we want to say the color is going to be the primary blue, or whatever our primary color is. And you can see things are actually coming together here. Just to add some separation, let's go ahead and set up our border next. First thing we want to do is actually set the height, and this is also going to be the height of the input, whatever it may be. And the width of it is going to be whatever the smallest width can be on that device. And to do that, we can actually say stylesheet.hairline width. And that also means we need to go ahead and import stylesheet from React Native. So that's all good to go. And then we also want to set a background color for this. And we don't have a color for this yet, but we're going to call it border. So to set up this border color, we want to go to our app/index, and then I'll add it in here. So $border is going to be E2, E2, E2. Save that, save this, and we can see we've got this ever so slight border. Hopefully it actually shows up in the recording, but when you build this, you'll be able to see it. So now we can actually go ahead and set up our text input, which we can't currently see. Just like everything else, we're going to say the height is going to be the input height. We also want to make sure that it takes up the entirety of the space that's left over after we create this button. And to do that, we can say flex 1. We're also going to bump up the font size just a bit, but not as big as the text to the left. And then so I'm going to say font size 18. And then we want to give it some padding horizontally so that it's not bumped up right on the border and right up on the edge. So say padding horizontal of 8. We also want to give it a color, and this is going to be input text, which we haven't set up yet. So if we go to the index.js, our app/index.js, and then we can put $input text, and that's just going to be 797979. Save that, save this. Everything should be good to go. We don't see anything yet, but when we actually tap the input and start typing, you can actually see things showing up. So that's all good to go. Obviously, this will just be numbers, but that's all looking good. Next thing we need to do is actually handle this state where it's not editable. So this shouldn't actually be editable, and we should pass that on to the actual text input. So to do this, we're going to have to do a few changes. Most of them are going to take place in this input with button. First off, let's actually close this so we can see more. We're no longer going to implicitly return, so I'm just going to copy that quickly and then paste it in here, and we'll return this. So the first thing we want to do is go ahead and take this destruction we did up here, and again I'm going to cut that. I'm just going to pass props, because something we're going to do is any props are just going to be automatically passed down to this text input, and that's just so we don't have to manually kind of put an interface layer between it, because the only things we really care about are these 3 props, but there are a host of other things we can pass on to the text input. It'll make more sense when we actually do that. But first thing I want to do is take that destruction we did before and then make that equal to props, just so that's available to us. Now we can take these props and actually pass this on down to our text input. So by doing that, this editable property, which is on props, will be passed on to our text input. So when I actually tap this input, I can't do anything with it like I can in this one. So let's actually go ahead and set this up so that it's visually clear that when an input is not editable, it'll show a light gray background. So what I'm going to do is set up a new variable, and it's going to be called container styles. And in here, we're going to say it's going to be a styles.container, and we'll replace this right here, just like that. And then we'll say if editable is equal to false, so if it's not editable, we're then going to push a new style onto it. So we're going to say container styles.push styles.container disabled, which we haven't set up yet. So if we go to our styles file for this component, we can scroll down here, and let's actually keep this near the container setup. So we'll say container disabled, and in here all we're changing is the background color. And just like in all other places, I don't want to put the actual hex value inside of my style sheet, because we might want to use it somewhere else. So I'll go to my app/index.js, and I'm going to say light gray is going to be F0, F0, F0. Save that up here, and then we can go ahead and use the style sheet light gray within our container. So that's all set up, and when we actually save this, you can see that for our disabled input, we've got a slightly gray background, and up here we've got a pure white background. Now, if you're running on Android, which I don't have it set up currently, you may be seeing a underline underneath your input, and you can leave that there. It's an Android thing, but if you don't want that there, you can go ahead and pass this property called underline color Android, and if you just set that to transparent, that underline will still exist, but it'll be transparent, so you won't actually see it. Now, the final thing we want to do is actually change the underlay color of this touchable highlight whenever these buttons are pressed. And to do that, there's a property on touchable highlight, which is called underlay color. And we could set that to whatever value we want to. So just to demo it, we'll say underlay color, and I'll just set this up to be underlay color, and we'll just say that's going to be really obnoxious blue. So when I press this, it'll be that obnoxious blue. That's not exactly what we want, so in this case we're going to go ahead and leverage the color module which we imported. So if I go up here and I import color from color, which we've installed previously, we then want to set up some local variables, local style variables, to actually determine what exactly this should look like. So we're going to go to our styles.js, and up here we're going to set up some local variables for this specific style sheet. And the first variable we're going to set up is going to be $button background color base, and this can be whatever you want. We're going to go ahead and use that white global variable we set up before. And then we're also going to set up a button background color modifier, and this is just going to be a number which we'll actually use to determine exactly how dark we should make that background. So we've got those two things set up, and because they're local variables to this style sheet, we can actually access those from within our input button. So looking here, we can go ahead and replace that blue, and we're going to say color, and then inside of here we want to access that button background color base. That'll be the first argument to this. And then we want to say darken, and that's a function on this color. And we want to then use the styles dot button background color modifier, and that'll go ahead and actually modify the background color. Regardless of how it changes, if we change that to a bright pink, it'll modify it and make it darker by 0.1. So now if I go ahead and actually tap this, you can see it's very light gray back there, just enough to indicate that you're actually tapping it. You always want to make sure you show some sort of interaction with a touchable in your application. Alright, bear with me, we are just about done working through this. I'm sure it's just as much work as it is recording this quite long lesson. So we're going to go to our home.js and actually start adding a few more things. First off is going to be our default value, and that's where we're going to use that temp base price that we set up before. Something else that we want to do is actually specify the keyboard type. And if I look at the simulator, when you focus on an input, if the actual keyboard isn't pressing or showing up and you're on a Mac, on Android it should always show up no matter what, but if you're on a Mac looking at the iOS simulator, you can press Command K to actually get that keyboard to pop up. Just ignore that everything's hidden behind it. We'll take care of that in an upcoming lesson. But if we go ahead and pass this keyboard type and set that to numeric, open that up, you can see that just numbers are available to us now. And something else with that default value, you can see that the value defaults for us. And we're also going to want to set up a way to actually detect any typing that's going on here. So I'm going to say on change text, and this is going to be handle text change. And this is a new function we need to go ahead and set up here. And that'll take a parameter, and we'll just say console.log change text, and we'll actually return what that new text is. Make sure to actually type console correctly if you're doing that. Last thing we want to do is actually specify a value down here for this second input, and we will set this to temp quote price until we actually set up the real stuff. So you can see now we've got our two different inputs. We've got our keyboard popping up, it's just numbers. I'll go ahead and close that. When we tap this, it's showing that slightly gray background. And if we compare it to our actual mockups, you can see we've got the exact same thing. If you're working on Android, you'll be seeing this input as well. So that was a beast of a lesson. If you've got any questions, make sure to ask. Trust me, this is the most complex component we'll be building, so everything will be easier from here on out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.